Finland, a country that shares more than 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia and for decades has tried to avoid provoking Moscow. But on March 5, 2026, the government in Helsinki took a step that drew the attention of security analysts across Europe. The Finnish government announced a plan to amend national security legislation to allow NATO nuclear weapons to transit through or even be deployed on its territory. You may be very surprised to learn how significant a strategic advantage this move could create for NATO in Northern Europe. For decades, Finnish law enacted in 1987 completely prohibited nuclear weapons from appearing on its territory. But if the new proposal is approved by Parliament, it would mean that NATO's nuclear deterrence capability could appear just about 150 kilometers from the Russian city of St. Petersburg. Helsinki has opened the possibility of placing part of the Western Alliance's deterrent power right along Russia's northwestern border. So why would Finland make such a bold decision? The answer lies in the entirely new security environment in Europe following the war in Ukraine. In recent years, Finnish strategists have grown increasingly concerned about Russia's military activities in the Baltic and Arctic regions. Large-scale exercises, force buildups in northwestern Russia, and the increasingly dense presence of strategic weapon systems have forced Helsinki to reassess its entire traditional security policy. And for that reason, the Finnish government decided to change a principle that had existed for nearly 4 decades. Because when you allow NATO's nuclear deterrence capability to access your territory, the strategic equation changes completely. From Moscow's perspective, that means key military centers in northwestern Russia are now, for the first time, within the direct deterrence range of the Western Alliance. This is the moment when Russia's security strategy in Northern Europe begins to collide with a new NATO defensive wall. We will explain this later in the video. When Finland's decision is placed on the map, it is clear that it does not only target St. Petersburg. The real strategic target lies farther north. That is the Kola Peninsula, the most important Russian military stronghold in the Arctic and the center of Moscow's sea-based nuclear power. Russia has turned Kola into a strategic fortress for decades at the bases of Murmansk and Severomorsk. The Northern Fleet deploys strategic ballistic missile submarines, Boris-class and Delta-class submarines, carrying dozens of nuclear warheads capable of striking targets thousands of kilometers away. These submarines are an essential part of Russia's nuclear deterrent triad, alongside land-based ballistic missile forces and strategic bombers. For that reason, Moscow has always viewed the Kola Peninsula as an area of vital importance to national security. For decades, Russian strategists believed the region was almost impregnable. The harsh Arctic geography, extreme climate, and the long distance from most NATO bases made it one of the safest areas in Russia's entire military structure. Around Kola, Moscow built a multi-layered defense network. Early warning radar systems, air bases, long-range air defense systems, and naval forces were positioned to form a vast anti-access zone. In the Kremlin's view, this area is the center of an Arctic fortress, where nuclear submarines can leave their bases, move into the Barents Sea, and operate in a tightly protected body of water. But everything here is beginning to change. When Finland joined NATO in 2023, the strategic picture of the entire Northern European region began to shift. And when Helsinki took another step by considering allowing NATO nuclear weapons to be present on its territory, the safe distance Moscow once relied on began to shrink. From northern Finland to the Kola Peninsula is only a few hundred kilometers. That means NATO radar systems, reconnaissance aircraft, and forces can now approach closer than ever to the operational area of the Northern Fleet. Reconnaissance flights, sensor systems, and aerial surveillance operations can monitor more closely Russia's military movements in the Barents Sea and the Arctic. And that leads to a very important consequence. The routes that Russian nuclear submarines use to leave their bases and move into the ocean. Routes once considered safe corridors, now lie closer to NATO's observation range. For Moscow, this is an extremely sensitive issue, because Russia's entire sea-based nuclear deterrence strategy depends on the ability of these submarines to operate secretly, remain difficult to detect, and always be ready to retaliate in the event of a nuclear conflict. If strategic submarines are tracked or detected early, an important part of that deterrent capability would be weakened. For that reason, changes in the strategic environment around the Kola Peninsula are always monitored extremely closely by Moscow. As NATO moves closer to this area, the geographic advantage Russia possessed for decades is beginning to shrink, and that is precisely why Finland's decision has provoked a strong reaction from Russia. But the strategic competition around Kola is not taking place only at sea or in the nuclear domain. Changes in Helsinki's policy are causing the entire military map of Northern Europe to begin shifting. A country that maintained neutrality for decades is now rapidly integrating into NATO's defense system. And these very steps are transforming Finland from a previously neutral state into one of NATO's most important defensive front lines in Northern Europe. After joining NATO in 2023, Finland began a military strengthening program considered the largest in the country's entire modern history. For decades, Helsinki maintained a substantial defense force, but after the war in Ukraine and the shift in Europe's security environment, the Finnish government decided to elevate its defense system to an entirely new level. One of the most significant steps was the contract to purchase 64 American F-35 stealth fighters, a deal worth more than $10 billion. When fully deployed, these F-35s will become the backbone of the Finnish Air Force and integrate directly with NATO's operational network. That means the skies over Northern Europe can now be monitored by one of the most advanced combat systems in the world. But Finland's military strength does not lie only in modern aircraft. The country still maintains one of the largest mandatory conscription systems in Europe. Every year, tens of thousands of citizens receive military training, creating a reserve force capable of mobilizing nearly 900,000 soldiers in an emergency. For a country with a population of just over 5 million people, that is an extremely remarkable number. This reflects the total defense philosophy Finland has built over many decades. Not only the military, but the entire society is prepared for crisis scenarios. One clear example of this is the enormous network of civilian shelters spread throughout Finland's cities. Many security experts believe this is the largest shelter system in Europe, capable of protecting most of the population in an emergency. But the most notable change is happening along the 1,140-kilometer border with Russia. The Finnish government has begun building a border fence about 200 kilometers long, equipped with cameras, sensors, and modern electronic surveillance systems. This is not just a simple fence. It is part of a multi-layered border control system designed to detect early infiltration activities or pressure from across the border. Meanwhile, military bases in southern Finland are also beginning to play a new role. Bases that once served only the Finnish defense forces are now being used by NATO for joint exercises and coordinated military operations. This allows alliance forces to deploy quickly and operate in Northern Europe when necessary. When all these elements are put together, an entirely new picture begins to emerge. Finland is no longer the neutral country that stood between NATO and Russia for decades. The country is rapidly becoming an important part of the alliance's northern defense system, and as this new defensive line begins to take shape, its impact is not limited to Finland's borders. It is spreading across the entire Baltic region, where Russia's neighboring countries are also taking unprecedented military steps. When looking south on the Baltic map, another chain of military reactions is also unfolding at remarkable speed. The three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are strengthening their defenses in a way that Europe has rarely witnessed in decades. After the war in Ukraine erupted, all three countries sharply increased their defense budgets, viewing this as a necessary step to prepare for a new security environment. For the Baltic governments, the threat from Russia is no longer a theoretical scenario, but a direct security concern. Estonia is leading this process. Tallinn has begun building a new defense system called the Baltic Defense Line, a chain of fortifications and bunkers positioned along the border with Russia. The system includes hardened defensive positions, anti-tank trenches, and observation points designed to slow or block any mechanized force entering Estonian territory. This is not just a single military construction, but part of a long-term defense strategy aimed at turning the entire eastern border into a multi-layered defensive line. Meanwhile, Lithuania is taking another step that is no less strategic. The government in Vilnius has allowed German troops to deploy permanently on its territory. This is an important shift, because for the first time since the end of the Cold War, a major German military unit is being stationed long-term in the Baltic region. This presence not only strengthens Lithuania's defensive capability, but also sends a clear signal about NATO's commitment to the security of the region. Latvia is also accelerating its military programs. Riga has invested heavily in new military infrastructure, from logistics bases to transportation routes that can support the rapid deployment of NATO forces in the event of a crisis. At the same time, the country is increasing military cooperation with its allies in the alliance and participating more frequently in joint exercises. When all these moves are put together, a new strategic picture begins to form around the Baltic Sea. To the north is Finland, a country that has recently joined NATO and is strengthening its defense capabilities. To the south are the three Baltic states, countries that are building defensive lines along their borders with Russia. The coordination between these countries forms a defensive belt surrounding the Baltic region. This makes Russia's ability to exert military pressure in the region far more complicated, because any move here would now have to face a network defense system linking multiple NATO countries, and this defensive arc continues to expand. Another region of Europe is also experiencing similar strategic changes. That region is Scandinavia. Scandinavia, a land long known for policies of balance and avoiding military confrontation, is gradually turning into a new defensive wall of NATO. The most important turning point in this process came in 2024, when Sweden officially joined NATO. That decision ended more than 2 centuries of military neutrality for Stockholm, a tradition that began in the early 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars. For decades, Sweden served as a strategic buffer between NATO and Russia. But after the war in Ukraine and the changes in Europe's security environment, the Swedish government concluded that the old model of neutrality was no longer sufficient to guarantee national security. When Stockholm entered NATO, the strategic map of Northern Europe immediately changed. The Western Alliance now gained access to one of the most important geographic positions in the Baltic Sea and the Scandinavian region. At the same time, Norway, a longtime NATO member in Northern Europe, also began strengthening military cooperation with the United States and the United Kingdom in the Arctic region. Norway's air and naval bases are increasingly being used for joint training operations with NATO forces. Large-scale exercises in Northern Europe and the North Atlantic have also become more frequent. Forces from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and many other NATO countries have participated in exercises designed to test combat capabilities in the harsh climate conditions of the polar region. This allows the alliance to build combat experience in an environment that was previously dominated mainly by Russia. When all these factors combine, Scandinavia begins to form a connected defense network, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic. Finland in the east, Sweden in the center, and Norway in the northwest create a chain of strategic positions surrounding Russia's operational areas in the polar region. For Moscow, this means its military forces in the north now face pressure from multiple directions. Russia is forced to disperse its military resources to protect bases, transport routes, and operational zones across a much larger space, and that is the turning point in the region's security structure. Scandinavia, a region that had been considered neutral and stable for many decades, is now becoming an important part of NATO's defensive line. From the Baltic to the Arctic, a new military network is gradually taking shape. When looking back at this entire chain of events, one thing becomes clear. Europe's security environment has changed profoundly since the war in Ukraine began. For decades after the Cold War, most of Northern Europe was considered relatively stable, with countries such as Finland and Sweden maintaining a certain distance from military alliances. But what has been happening in recent years shows that picture has completely changed. NATO now has a stronger presence in the Baltic and Northern Europe than at any time since the end of the 20th century. The accession of Finland and Sweden has not only expanded the alliance politically, but has also directly changed Europe's military map. Russia now faces a much longer NATO border than before, stretching from the Baltic all the way to the Arctic region. At the same time, Northern Europe, once considered a neutral zone, is becoming increasingly militarized. Countries in the region are sharply increasing defense budgets, modernizing their militaries, and expanding military cooperation with the United States and NATO allies. From new defense systems in the Baltic to large-scale exercises in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic, the entire region is shifting into a completely different security posture compared with the past. This creates new strategic pressure on Moscow. Russia can no longer focus on only one strategic direction. Instead, it must disperse military resources to monitor and defend multiple areas along its western and northern borders. These changes did not happen overnight, but step by step, they are reshaping the balance of power in Europe. And in that process, Finland's decision plays the role of an important starting point. When Helsinki chose to integrate more deeply with NATO's defense structure, the strategic balance in Northern Europe began to shift clearly. A region that was once considered a buffer zone between Russia and the West is now becoming a direct part of NATO's defense system. That not only changes how European countries view their security, it also reflects a new reality in relations between Russia and the West, a reality in which the strategic boundary between the two sides is becoming increasingly clear, and the security decisions of each country in the region can create geopolitical impacts far beyond their own borders. If you find this analysis useful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our latest geopolitics videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.